The morning haze still clung to the coastline of Southern California when the first call crackled over the radio. 6 miles offshore, a Coast Guard helicopter hovered low, its blades cutting the mist in a steady, anxious rhythm. Below, the Pacific rolled in slow, heavy breaths, indifferent to the grim discovery drifting in its depths. It wasn't debris. It wasn't a lost buoy. It was a man. His body floated face down, tangled in kelp and seawater, the current nudging him toward the shoreline, as though the ocean itself was ready to give him back. At first glance, it could have been a tragic accident, a man swept overboard, another name on the long list of maritime misfortunes. But trained eyes notice what casual ones do not. This man's story was never going to end with a coroner's checkbox reading accidental drowning. When investigators rolled him over, the Pacific gave up its first damning secret, a small, neat hole punched into the back of his skull. One gunshot, execution style. The kind of wound that tells you someone wanted him silenced permanently. In that instant, a tragedy turned into a homicide. The coroner couldn't identify him at the scene. The sea had worked too long at erasing his face. But soon the name surfaced: Stephen B. Williams. For some, the revelation was a shock. For others, a cold inevitability. Williams wasn't just any victim. In the 1980s, his voice owned the Denver airwaves. A radio DJ with a quick wit and an infectious laugh, the kind of man listeners felt they knew personally. But behind the microphone, life had taken sharp turns. Inheriting millions after his father's death, Williams slipped quietly out of the public eye, living comfortably until now. The question pressed in from every side: who wanted Stephen B. Williams dead? The answer wouldn't just lead detectives into the murky world of financial deception and betrayal. It would also brush dangerously close to another dark thread: 5 young women who had vanished from the foggy, lawless corners of Northern California. The two stories should have been worlds apart. But here, under the cold gaze of a California sunrise, the first hints suggested otherwise. In the 1980s, Stephen B. Williams wasn't just a radio personality. He was a voice you couldn't escape if you lived in Denver. Known to listeners simply as Stephen B., he co-hosted one of the hottest morning shows on the dial. His laugh was infectious, his banter quick, and he had that rare ability to make even the morning traffic report feel like a conversation between friends. People didn't just tune in, they trusted him. He had a way of pulling strangers in, making them feel like they were part of his inner circle. But fame is a fickle thing. By the early 2000s, Stephen's on-air career had cooled. Life, however, handed him a different kind of windfall. When his father passed away, Stephen inherited more than $2 million to someone that could secure his future and free him from the grind of the industry. And for a man who had spent decades waking up before sunrise to chase ratings, early retirement wasn't just appealing, it felt like the universe's reward for years of hard work. Stephen wasn't extravagant. He didn't chase yachts or private jets. But money for him was more a source of anxiety than pleasure. He hated the minutiae of managing it. Budgets bored him, tax codes confused him, and the idea of navigating investment portfolios was enough to make him retreat. His friends knew him as kind to a fault, generous with both time and money, and sometimes so trusting it hurt. If you told him you had the answer to a problem he didn't understand, he'd likely take you at your word. That open-hearted trust is how Harvey Morrow stepped into his life. Their first meeting seemed harmless, even serendipitous. Harvey recognized Stephen's name from his radio days, greeting him with the kind of familiarity only a long-time listener could fake with conviction. Harvey painted himself as a self-made financial wizard, a former Wall Street insider who had parlayed his expertise into a fortune. He dropped casual references to high-stakes deals, luxury properties, and exclusive investment circles. It was the language of money spoken with the confidence of someone who'd been swimming in it for years. Harvey didn't just flatter Stephen. He positioned himself as the missing piece in Stephen's post-radio life. Here was a man who could take the headache of financial management off his hands and turn that inheritance into something even greater. Harvey's pitch wasn't just about making money, it was about protecting it. He spoke in reassuring tones about the unnecessary bite the IRS would take if Stephen didn't act smart. Offshore accounts, Harvey explained, were the key. British Virgin Islands, a place Stephen barely knew existed, suddenly became the centerpiece of his financial future. Harvey laid out the plan to transfer a significant portion of his inheritance into a discreet, tax-efficient account overseas. With Harvey's expertise, those funds wouldn't just sit, they'd grow. And all Stephen had to do was trust him. Trust came easily to Stephen. Harvey's confidence was magnetic, his stories rich with the kind of details that made them hard to doubt. The idea of legally sheltering his money from taxes while also increasing it sounded like a blessing. To Stephen, it felt like the perfect convergence of opportunity and loyalty, a listener who had been there for him in his radio days, now returning the favor in a meaningful way. What Stephen didn't know, what he couldn't imagine, was that the account Harvey spoke of so convincingly didn't have Stephen's name on it at all. The paperwork, the transfers, the signatures, they all led back to Harvey. Every dollar Stephen moved overseas was slipping from his control into Harvey's hands. But in those early days, there were no red flags in Stephen's eyes. Harvey was polished, connected, and seemed to live the life his resume promised. Expensive suits, the ease with which he navigated talk about global finance, the confident way he spoke of protecting assets, all of it reinforced the illusion. Stephen's friends would later recall how animated he was about his financial guardian angel. He believed he had stumbled onto the kind of partnership most people only dream of, a trusted advisor who wasn't just in it for the commission, someone who had a personal stake in his success. He couldn't have known then that Harvey's stake was far more personal than he'd ever suspect, and that this partnership would soon set in motion a chain of events that would lead him far from the comfort of Denver radio and into the dangerous waters off the California coast. By the time Harvey Morrow suggested that Stephen B. Williams move on to his yacht, their relationship had settled into something that looked on the surface like deep friendship. Harvey had been in Stephen's ear for months, talking investments, assuring him his offshore account in the British Virgin Islands was thriving, reminding him that smart money works while you sleep. To Stephen, Harvey wasn't just a financial advisor. He was the guy who had swooped in at the perfect moment, offering expertise where Stephen had none. The yacht was Harvey's pride, a 69-foot luxury vessel, berthed in the exclusive San Pedro Yacht Club in Los Angeles. Harvey painted it as a floating dream, a place where they could live well and plot their next moves while escaping the grind of everyday life. For Stephen, who'd always been drawn to the coast and who saw life as something meant to be enjoyed, the offer felt less like a business move and more like a gift from a friend. So he packed his things and moved aboard. The yacht gleamed in the California sun, its polished wood and chrome reflecting the image Harvey wanted the world to see. What Stephen didn't know was that the gloss came at a staggering price, his price. Without Stephen's awareness, Harvey had been funneling more than $1.7 million of his inheritance into a full-scale renovation of the yacht. New engines, custom interiors, state-of-the-art navigation systems, each improvement was a quiet theft dressed up as luxury. Stephen didn't ask too many questions. Harvey had a way of making everything sound under control. He used the language of investment, even when talking about the boat upgrades, increased value expenses were assets in disguise. Stephen believed him because he wanted to believe him. After all, Harvey was the one steering his financial future. Why would he sabotage his own client? Days on the yacht were intoxicating. The marina's still mornings, the salt air, the gentle rocking of the vessel, it all fed into the illusion that life was not just good, but stable. Harvey hosted dinners on deck, weaving stories of his Wall Street past, dropping hints about upcoming opportunities, speaking of money the way a chef speaks of ingredients, knowing exactly how to combine them for the perfect result. But outside the bubble of the marina, Stephen's reality was shifting. When he needed quick access to cash, a simple transfer from his offshore account, things got strange. The balance he expected wasn't there. Wire transfers stalled. The bank's responses were vague. At first, Harvey brushed it off. It's just a hiccup. International transactions take time. Stephen wanted to believe him. Weeks passed. The hiccup didn't go away. Stephen began pressing harder, but Harvey always had a reason. An investment was maturing, a document was pending, a holiday overseas was slowing things down. It was smoke, and Stephen didn't yet realize there was fire. The tipping point came when Stephen found himself in the humiliating position of not being able to pay for a basic expense. A dinner with friends, the bill arrived and his card was declined. The embarrassment cut deep, but worse was the realization this wasn't just a temporary glitch. He no longer controlled his own money. That night alone in his cabin on the yacht, Stephen began to replay every conversation with Harvey. The advice, the reassurances, the way Harvey had insisted on handling everything himself. The memory of signing over account access under the promise of tax optimization now felt like handing a stranger the keys to his house and hoping they'd lock the door behind them. Stephen's trust, the trust that had carried him through months of quiet doubt, was starting to fracture. He called Harvey into the main salon one evening and for the first time didn't couch his questions in politeness. "Where's my money, Harvey?" The words were blunt, the tone harder than Harvey had heard before. Harvey, smooth as ever, tried to wrap the conversation in a blanket of calm. "It's safe. It's working for you. You'll see the return soon." But this time the words didn't land. Stephen wasn't listening for reassurance. He was listening for proof, and Harvey had none to give. Friends who had tried to warn Stephen months earlier suddenly came to mind. They told him Harvey's generosity felt performative, that his confidence was too polished, that real friends don't need you to sign paperwork to prove loyalty. He'd waved them off then. But sitting there staring across the glossy mahogany table at Harvey's carefully composed face, Stephen understood what they had been trying to tell him. The decision came fast. He was going to get his money back. Not next month, not after the investment cycle, not when Harvey decided it was convenient. He wanted it now. He told Harvey as much, making it clear this was not a request but a demand. In that moment, the dynamic between them shifted. Whatever camaraderie they'd shared evaporated. Harvey no longer looked like the man who'd offered Stephen a seat on his yacht. He looked like the man standing between Stephen and the life he'd built. And for the first time, Stephen wasn't afraid to push back. He didn't know it yet, but demanding his money back was more than a confrontation. It was the moment he signed his own death warrant. The confrontation over the missing money didn't explode into a public fight. Harvey, calm as ever, suggested they take the yacht out for a short trip, a chance to clear the air and talk privately away from the noise of the marina. Catalina Island, he said, was the perfect escape. To Stephen, it sounded like a moment to press his demands, to finally corner Harvey without interruptions. On the morning they set out, the sky over Los Angeles was clear, the Pacific deceptively calm. GPS records would later place the Iola Mara easing away from San Pedro Yacht Club, its bow pointed toward Catalina. 2 men aboard, friends at least to any observer watching from shore. No one knows exactly what happened on the open water. There were no witnesses, no distress calls, no Mayday transmissions. But what is known is that the yacht never made Catalina in the way a pleasure trip should. The following morning, GPS data shows the Iola Mara returning to port. This time, Harvey was alone. No Stephen, no explanation, just a man stepping back onto the dock with the air of someone who'd been out too long. Witnesses remember him looking different, drained clothes rumpled, hair unkempt. The tailored polish he usually wore like armor was gone. He moved quickly, avoiding conversation. It would take days before the ocean surrendered its truth. 6 miles off the coast, a fisherman spotted something tangled in kelp. At first, it looked like flotsam, a dark shape rocking in the swells. But when the Coast Guard arrived, they knew. It was human. The body had been in the water long enough for the sea to begin its erasure. Facial features were unrecognizable, skin bloated from salt and time. But one thing stood out, a wound so precise it couldn't be mistaken. A single bullet hole in the back of the skull. The coroner's report made it official. Stephen B. Williams had been executed. Not an accident, not a slip overboard in rough water. Someone had put a gun to his head and pulled the trigger. And the last man known to be with him alive was Harvey Morrow. Whatever had happened between San Pedro and Catalina wasn't a financial disagreement anymore. It was murder, and the Pacific had just given detectives their first damning piece of proof. By the time Stephen's body was pulled from the Pacific and the coroner confirmed what the wound to his skull already screamed, Harvey Morrow had vanished. He didn't just slip away quietly, he evaporated. One day his yacht sat polished and pristine in its slip at San Pedro. The next, it was stripped of any trace that Stephen had ever lived aboard. Harvey's personal items were gone. No note, no forwarding address. The man who had been the center of Stephen's financial world was now nothing but an empty space on the dock. Detectives moved fast. This was no longer a financial dispute. This was a homicide with a very clear last man seen in the picture. A murder warrant was signed, and Harvey Morrow's name went out on state and federal bulletins. Soon the FBI joined the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Homicide Bureau in the hunt. Harvey's face appeared on wanted lists circulated to ports, airports, and border stations. His description was pushed to every major law enforcement database in the country. But Harvey was no amateur when it came to disappearing. His entire life had been a series of carefully constructed fictions. Investigators digging into his past found a pattern that went far beyond his dealings with Stephen B. Williams. He had a rap sheet, not the kind built in alleys, but in boardrooms and bank lobbies. Years earlier, Harvey had conned his own second wife, Deborah, a respected banking consultant, into believing he was a wealthy, self-made investor. When they married, she thought she was entering a life of stability and privilege. Instead, she was walking into the machinery of a professional swindle. Harvey convinced her to sell her Texas home and pour the proceeds into his dream yacht. He spun stories about their future global voyages, shared investments, a life of freedom at sea. The reality, while Deborah stayed in Texas, Harvey used her money to maintain his luxury lifestyle in California, all while bleeding her dry. She sent him $12,000 a month under the belief that he was expanding their shared wealth. She didn't know she was financing the illusion. Even the diamond ring he placed on her finger at their wedding, a symbol of commitment, was a cheap fake. Deborah would later describe the betrayal as a rape of the soul. It wasn't just the money, it was the calculated precision with which Harvey had dismantled her trust. When detectives interviewed her, she admitted she believed Harvey was capable of anything, including murder. For law enforcement, Harvey's history only sharpened the urgency of finding him. This was a man who lived on charm and manipulation, who thrived in the gray spaces where trust blurred into control. He'd conned romantic partners, business associates, and now, allegedly, a friend out of millions. The concern was simple: if Harvey could talk his way into someone's bank account, he could talk his way into another hideout. And yet, despite the push, the trail went cold almost immediately. Harvey knew how to cover his tracks. He avoided using traceable credit cards. He skipped obvious border crossings. No property records, no new vehicle registrations, no sign of him in marinas where his name might raise alarms. Weeks turned into months. The FBI chased tips from Florida to the Caribbean. There were rumors he'd fled to the British Virgin Islands, where the offshore account had been set up. Others swore they'd seen him in Mexico, blending in among American expatriates living cheaply and anonymously. But every lead ended in dust. In homicide, work time is a predator. The longer a suspect is free, the harder they are to catch. Harvey's disappearance began to look less like a man on the run and more like a ghost story, a name on a wanted poster that faded a little more each day. Inside the homicide unit, frustration grew. Detectives who had been certain they would have Harvey in cuffs within weeks now stared at empty case boards. The irony was bitter. Harvey Morrow, a man who lived in public performances, dinners on the yacht, tailored suits, polished stories about his success, had mastered invisibility when it mattered most. It wasn't just that he was missing, it was that he had left no ripples in the water he'd slipped into. For Stephen's friends and family, the silence was brutal. They knew who had been with him last. They knew the man's history. They knew the yacht trip to Catalina had been his final journey. And yet months later, the man they believed had killed him was out there somewhere, eating in restaurants, sleeping in beds, maybe even smiling at new marks the way he once smiled at Stephen. The case didn't die, but it settled into a grim limbo. Detectives kept Harvey's file close, waiting for the mistake every fugitive eventually makes. But until then, the hunt for the charming con man who turned the Pacific into his dumping ground seemed like it might stretch on forever. In Great Falls, Montana, winter had started to settle in when Harvey Morrow walked into a small used car dealership looking for work. To most people, he appeared to be just another well-dressed newcomer looking for a fresh start. But to Joe Parsetic, the dealership's finance manager and a former police officer, Harvey was a riddle wrapped in polish. Joe had spent years reading people both on the street and across the negotiating table. The first thing that struck him was how over-rehearsed Harvey seemed. Every movement was deliberate. His suit was sharp, his hair meticulously combed, and his handshake lingered just long enough to feel calculated. In a small Montana town where understatement was the norm, Harvey's presentation screamed outsider. Still, Joe hired him. Sales was a business where confidence sold cars, and Harvey had confidence in spades. But almost immediately, the performance began to fray. Around the coffee machine, Harvey would launch into elaborate stories about his past, a glittering life as a wealthy financial advisor, the tragic loss of his wife in a freak boating accident, and his decision to leave the ocean behind forever because the water hurt too much to look at. On their own, these tales might have passed as eccentricities. But when Harvey sat down to do the paperwork that came with selling cars, Joe saw the cracks widen. Harvey made basic accounting errors, sloppy math, missed signatures, misfiled forms. These weren't the mistakes of a man who had once moved millions across international markets. They were the mistakes of someone pretending to have. Joe's instincts lit up. He started asking small questions the way cops do when they're circling something they can't yet name. Where exactly had Harvey lived before coming to Montana? What happened to the yacht he'd once mentioned? Harvey's answers were vague, sometimes shifting from one telling to the next. One evening after Harvey claimed he lived in a modest rental house across town, Joe decided to check for himself. He drove by the address Harvey had given him. No lights, no car, no sign of life. Instead, he found Harvey's vehicle parked outside a low-budget roadside motel, the kind favored by drifters and people avoiding attention. The discovery snapped the picture into focus. Joe didn't know exactly what Harvey had done, but he knew enough to believe it was serious. He went home and did what any ex-cop would do. He started digging. Internet searches turned up fragments, a homicide in California, a missing yacht companion whispers about millions gone missing. The name Harvey Morrow began appearing alongside words like suspect and wanted. The next day, Joe called the local police. He told them what he'd found, and they put him in touch with Sergeant Kenneth Clark of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. Clark had been chasing Harvey for months. The moment Joe said the name, Clark's tone shifted from curious to urgent. This was the break he'd been waiting for. Clark asked Joe to keep Harvey close to make sure he didn't vanish again. That was easier said than done. Harvey was restless, prone to disappearing for hours, and Joe knew the man's instincts for self-preservation were razor sharp. One hint that he was being hunted, and Harvey would be gone before sunset. 2 days later, Clark flew into Great Falls. The plan was simple. Joe would alert him when Harvey was in a place they could corner him. Late that afternoon, Harvey pulled into the dealership lot. Joe made the call. Minutes later, the quiet rhythm of the dealership was broken by the sound of multiple engines. Local police cruisers rolled in, joined by a federal marshal. Clark stepped out, scanning the lot until his eyes locked on the man he'd been hunting. Harvey froze for just a moment, long enough for Clark to read the recognition in his face. The arrest was swift, almost anticlimactic. Harvey didn't fight. He didn't raise his voice. He simply watched as the cuffs closed around his wrists, the performance polished even in defeat. For Joe, it was a strange kind of satisfaction, not the rush of a chase, but the relief of knowing the man who had walked so casually into his life wouldn't be walking out of anyone else's without leaving destruction behind. In that Montana parking lot, months of evasion ended. Harvey Morrow, the man who had eluded the FBI, the LAPD, and every other set of eyes trained on him, had been brought down not by a sprawling manhunt, but by one former cop who trusted his gut. When the cuffs closed around Harvey Morrow's wrists in that Montana dealership lot, the long game was over. Within days, he was shackled for transport, escorted under heavy guard back to Los Angeles. The state of California was ready for him. The extradition was the formal start of the end. Detectives had spent months building their case, GPS data charting the yacht's trip to Catalina, and back bank records tracing millions from Stephen's inheritance into Harvey's hands, the forensic certainty of a bullet wound to the back of the skull. This wasn't circumstantial suspicion anymore. It was a blueprint of premeditation, motive, and opportunity. Prosecutors didn't hesitate. They filed the highest possible charge, first-degree murder, with special circumstances, the special being profit killing for financial gain. In California, that charge carried only two possible sentences: life without parole or death. When Harvey appeared in court for the first time, gone was the polished yacht owner in tailored suits. Jailhouse khaki replaced designer fabrics, but the practiced confidence remained. He smiled faintly at the cameras, shook his head at the accusations, and leaned on the same skill set that had carried him through decades of cons, the belief that he could talk his way out. His defense, such as it was almost surreal. Harvey claimed Stephen had taken his own life at sea. According to him, there had been no confrontation, no fight, no financial betrayal, just a tragic decision by a troubled man. He spoke the lie with the same steady tone he once used to sell million-dollar investment schemes. But this time, no one was buying. The prosecution dismantled the story piece by piece. Stephen's friends testified about his optimism and his plans to demand repayment. Financial experts walked the jury through the offshore accounts, showing exactly how Stephen's money had been siphoned off. Forensic pathologists explained the trajectory of the bullet, impossible for a self-inflicted shot. Every element of the case pointed in one direction: Harvey had killed Stephen to silence him forever and keep the money. The jury didn't need long. The verdict came back guilty of first-degree murder for financial gain. Harvey's face as the words were read was impassive, a mask that had served him well, now useless. At sentencing, the judge didn't mince words. He called the murder cold, calculated, and without mercy, a crime committed not in the heat of passion, but with deliberate, selfish intent. Then came the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Harvey would die behind bars. Even then, Harvey didn't break. He repeated his suicide narrative to anyone who would listen, as though saying it enough times might make it true. But the court had spoken, the evidence was sealed in record, and the Pacific had already told its story. For Stephen's family and friends, it was justice delayed but delivered. For Harvey Morrow, it was the last con that would never pay out. Northern California wears two faces. One is the postcard beauty towering redwoods, jagged cliffs carved by the Pacific fog curling around sleepy harbor towns. The other is darker, quieter, and far less forgiving. This is Humboldt County, the heart of what locals and law enforcement call the Emerald Triangle, a region that produces more cannabis than anywhere else in America. It's a place where the economy thrives in both the open market and the shadows, where money flows in unmarked bills and people can vanish as easily as the morning fog. For decades, Humboldt has carried a reputation that teeters between myth and menace. Outsiders come for work or for the promise of a new life. Some find it, others disappear. The isolation is part of the allure, remote mountain roads, sprawling private land neighbors miles apart. But it's also part of the danger. Out here, help isn't a few minutes away. Sometimes it isn't coming at all. And then there's the place the locals call Murder Mountain. It's not a name conjured up by sensational media. It's a name born from history. Years ago, a notorious double murder gave the area its grim label, and since then, violence has left its mark again and again. Bodies have been found in shallow graves, victims of disputes over drugs, money, or simply wrong place, wrong time. Many cases remain unsolved, the killers never brought to justice. Against this backdrop, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Over the last 20 years, young women vanishing without a trace. 5 in particular have come to define the mystery, their names tied together under one haunting title, the Humboldt Missing 5. They were all under 40, most in their 20s. Pretty, small-framed, blonde hair, light eyes. Each one disappeared under circumstances that at first seemed unrelated. But as the years passed, their cases began to echo one another like footsteps down the same dark road. No one saw them leave. No bodies were found, at least not at first. Friends and family searched the wooded back roads, the rugged coastline, the makeshift camps hidden in the hills. Flyers faded on telephone poles. Tips came in fits and starts, never enough to lead to an arrest. For law enforcement, it was like chasing shadows in a county built for them. Humboldt isn't Los Angeles or San Francisco. There's no grid of security cameras to track movement, no constant police presence to deter predators. It's a place where someone can step off the map and keep walking until no one can find them. In that kind of landscape, a missing person can stay missing for years or forever. The Humboldt Missing 5 have become more than unsolved cases. They're a reminder that in places where beauty and danger share the same space, the line between the two can disappear overnight. And in Humboldt County, once someone crosses that line, they often don't come back. They were 5 women separated by years, but linked by a pattern too sharp to ignore. Jennifer Wilmer, Karen Mitchell, Sheila Franks, Danielle Berolini, and another young woman whose name, like theirs, became etched into Humboldt County's ledger of the missing. They were not strangers to the region, some locals, some drawn here by its promise of freedom and work. But they shared striking similarities that went far beyond coincidence: blonde hair, light eyes, petite builds. Vulnerable not in spirit but in stature, easy to overlook in a crowd, easy to overpower in the wrong moment. The first disappearances rattled the community, but in Humboldt, a place where people often come and go without explanation, vanishing can almost be mistaken for a lifestyle choice. That illusion began to dissolve when the count reached 5. 2 names rose to the surface again and again in the conversations of both locals and investigators: Sheila Franks and Danielle Berolini. These weren't cold cases buried under decades of dust. They were fresh wounds, 2 young women gone within weeks of each other. Sheila was a mother of 2 recently separated, trying to find her footing again. She had been living with a man named Jim Jones, not the infamous cult leader from history, but a sawmill worker in his 40s with deep roots in Humboldt. Jones wasn't just Sheila's boyfriend. He was her housemate, her partner, the man she saw every day. On the morning she vanished, Jones told police she simply decided to go for a walk and never returned. That was the last anyone saw of her. Danielle, just 23, had moved to the area from Maine, enchanted by Humboldt's natural beauty. She was finding her place working, making friends. But she had also crossed paths with Jim Jones. In fact, Jones was the last known person to see her alive. He told investigators he'd given her a ride, dropped her off near her home, and then never saw her again. The overlap was chilling. Two women both connected to the same man, both vanishing without a trace within days of each other. And it didn't stop there. As detectives dug deeper, they uncovered a third link. Years earlier, Karen Mitchell, a 16-year-old local who disappeared while walking through town, had also known Jones. She babysat for a friend of his, spent time in the same circles. It wasn't a close relationship, but it was enough to make investigators pause. Three of the Humboldt missing five had at least some tie to Jim Jones. For law enforcement, the connections didn't amount to proof, but they were impossible to ignore. In cases built on whispers and fragments, patterns are gold. And this one glinted under every angle of light. Jones, for his part, cooperated just enough to keep himself from being charged. He sat for interviews, repeated his version of events, admitted to knowing the women, but denied any involvement in their disappearances. His calmness frustrated investigators. It was the kind of composure that either came from innocence or from someone who'd learned how to outweigh suspicion. The family saw it differently. To them, Jones was the thread running through the tapestry of loss, the constant presence in stories that should have had nothing to do with each other. Every time they spoke his name, it was with the weight of unanswered questions and the sting of knowing that no one could make him answer them. In a place like Humboldt, where the forest swallows sound and the coastline hides its own secrets, those connections are both a lifeline and a torment. They give shape to the mystery, but they also remind everyone how close they are to the edge of something darker. For the families of the Humboldt missing five, that edge is where they've been living for years. The break came not from a witness, but from the river. Months after Danielle Berolini vanished, a local discovered a human skull lodged in the gravel bed of a shallow stream. Forensic analysis confirmed what her family had feared, but never wanted to believe it was Danielle. The cause of death couldn't be determined from the remains, but investigators ruled it a homicide. She hadn't run away. She hadn't started over somewhere new. She had been killed. For Sheila Franks, the evidence was different, but just as damning to the idea of voluntary disappearance. When police searched her home after she went missing, they found her wallet, her identification, her bank cards, even cash still neatly stored in the places she always kept them. Friends said she would never have left without those essentials, and certainly not without a word to her children. Two women gone, two stories ending in the same unrelenting void, and the last man known to have been with both of them was the same Jim Jones. Investigators made it official, labeling Jones a person of interest in the disappearances. It was a careful phrase chosen to signal suspicion without tipping into accusation. Jones had been cooperative enough to avoid arrest, agreeing to interviews, repeating his accounts. But every repetition only deepened the unease. His connection to Danielle and Sheila was undeniable. His history with Karen Mitchell hovered in the background like a shadow. Still, suspicion isn't evidence. Without a witness, without forensic proof tying him to the crime scenes, police couldn't cross the threshold from interest to charge. That legal gap has kept Jones outside the bars of a cell, even as he remains firmly inside the circle of the investigation. For the families, it's a purgatory. They can't escape the bitter knowledge of where the trail points and the equally bitter truth that it's not enough to bring justice home. Two stories, two very different paths. One ended with a verdict, the other still twists in the shadows. Harvey Morrow's fall was a study in greed laid bare. He wasn't content to con to steal, to live off the trust of others he killed to keep what he'd taken. The ocean tried to hide his crime, but GPS coordinates, bank records, and the hole in the back of Stephen B. Williams' skull told the truth louder than any alibi. Justice came for Harvey in the form of a life sentence without the possibility of parole. He will die in prison, stripped of the stage he built for himself. His was a crime of calculation, a cold transaction where a friend's life was just another asset to be liquidated. But in Humboldt County, the ledger remains open. The five young women who vanished there, Jennifer Wilmer, Karen Mitchell, Sheila Franks, Danielle Berolini, and another whose name joins theirs in quiet mourning, are still waiting for justice. One skull pulled from a river. One home left frozen in time, possessions untouched. A person of interest whose name repeats like an unanswered question. These are the fragments left behind, but they have yet to be assembled into a conviction. The difference between the two cases is proof. Harvey's crime was written in data and blood. Humboldt's mystery is written in whispers and absence. That absence is the predator. Here it lets the guilty walk free, lets families go to bed without answers, lets the story drift toward becoming just another local legend. It can't be allowed to. If you know something, no matter how small, no matter how long you've kept it, tell it. Call the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office. Call the tip lines. Send the email. The right fragment in the right hands can snap the whole picture into focus. Communities don't solve crimes by hoping someone else will speak. They solve them by standing together, by refusing to let the missing become forgotten. And so we end where both stories meet in the simple truth that justice never sleeps. Faces on flyers, names in case files, the voices of those lost, they wait. And they will keep waiting until someone helps bring them home. Justice is out there, and it will not rest.